But I think it's now 10:30, right? And my time here in Copenhagen. So I would like to warmly welcome you to this More Than Humans Collaborative Approaches session today. Thank you for joining the paper presenters, and thank you for the student volunteer, and thank you for the organizers for this fantastic conference and venue that we can take part. And thank you for the participants wherever you are joining us today. This session papers are drawing our attention to interrelations and interdependencies in design between humans and non-human entities, and open up new horizons for participatory design scholars and practitioners to rethink their mindsets as well as approaches to connect with more than human agencies. And I'm so much looking forward to learning from these papers. Can I have the next slide, please? So my name is Sanna-Maria Marttila, and I'm joining you today from Copenhagen, Denmark, where I currently live. Before we go to the actual session paper presentations, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the respective lands on which we meet today in this online session, including the lands in which Zoom's data centers are located, including Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Hong Kong, Melbourne, New York, Tokyo, Toronto, Silicon Valley, and Sydney. I also invite you, the participants, to share your location in the Zoom chat box. Where are you attending from? And if you feel like paying your respect and acknowledge traditional custodians and lands. I would like to pay respect to the ancestors, the human and non-human entities, past, present, and future, in these locations, and to their contributions to continuing cultures, heritage, and ecologies. As I mentioned, I'm joining from Copenhagen, Denmark, where I currently live. However, I am originally from northern part of Finland, and personally, I would like to pay respect to my grandfather, Erkki, and my family members and others, including Skolt Sami people who had to flee from their homes in Petsamo, Finland, when former Soviet Union invaded Finland during the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive in World War II. Furthermore, I wish to expand my respect to everyone who have been forced to leave their land, home, and loved ones due to military or cultural invasion and oppression or other crises. Kiitos. Thank you. This is the 7th day of the conference, so I'm sure that you're all more than you're familiar with this being together guidelines, but we just go them through together. So we ask to be kind and mindful of differences of any kind, and try to be patient with the technical constraints and hiccups we might have during the session. Please enter the spaces to listen deeply and participate with respect. Please mute your microphones during the sessions, and please try to avoid interrupting the presentations during the presentations. If you have any questions during the session, you can use the chat box, and we try to accommodate your questions and offer help if needed. We would also invite you to use the chat box to ask questions after the presentations. Please be careful in choice of words when you are making expressions, and try to be inclusive. And please try not to judge or trivialize others, and phrase any critiques respectfully with constructive advice. We are also asked to remind you that we are recording this session. So if you wish to be anonymous, please turn off your camera and de-identify yourself on Zoom. I already mentioned that we ask you to share your location and acknowledge the traditional custodians and lands. Thank you. So we start today with the presentation by Kirsi, Hakio, Markéta, Dolejšová, Tuuli, Mattelmäki, Hee-Jeong, Choi, and Cristina, Ampatzidou, with the exploratory paper titled Following Seals and Dogs, experimenting with personal dimension and transformative design. And now we are first having a video of the presentation performed by Kirsi.
Hello everyone, my name is Kirsi Hakio and I co-authored this paper with Markéta Dolejšová, Tuuli Mattelmäki, Choi, and Cristina Ampatzidou. And the title is Following Seals and Dogs, Experimenting with Personal Dimensions of Transformative Design. But first we would like to start by paying our respect to the land, Mother Earth, our home, and all the sea creatures, forest creatures, and more than human nature that coexist with us, and who really are the custodians of these places where we have conducted our research. Yes, in this exploratory paper, we were interested in understanding better how personal transformations can be taken into account in participatory design, but also in the larger context of eco-social change. What it looks like, what it feels like, how it could be captured and fostered. So we present two autoethnographic accounts of two experimental case studies. First, the Baltic Sea Lab study that was conducted in a zoological station in southern Finland. And the second case, the open forest walks conducted in central Bohemia, Czech Republic. Now, both of these cases were developed with an ongoing research project called Creatures that explores the transformative potential of creative practices. So by examining our experience as participatory practitioners, we wanted to better understand how can we become more attentive and attuned to our inner transformations that occur in implicit, subjective, and very private worlds. And also how these personal first-hand experiences might contribute towards larger eco-social change. Yes, the first experiment, Baltic Sea Lab, comes from Tuuli's reflections. So it is an experiment that is part of an ongoing series of workshops aiming to advance ocean literacy through creative practice and also promote sustainable change within marine ecosystems. It brought together creative practitioners, design researchers, and natural scientists for a two-day gathering in the zoological station to explore the local ecosystems and discuss diverse approaches to sea health. Now, this meant in practice learning about the local ecosystems, but also more direct engagement with the surroundings, including swimming, diving, collecting samples, and co-creating embodied connections to the ecosystem, as well as planning sessions. For example, in this picture, you can see how we prototyped and experimented with writing ocean confessions with seawater. Ocean confessions is an eco-ritual that it invites people to reconnect better with the ocean. So during these days, in several sessions, we also shared our concerns and reflections. One of the participants told a tale of a mythological creature called Selkie, which is both a human and a seal. So in a nutshell, the story goes that during the full moon, Selkies shed their skin and come up to dance on the seashores. By leaving their skin behind, they are able to transform into another being. You can read more about the tale from the paper, but the story inspired us to play with identities and nurtured us also to observe the world from a completely shifted perspective. And as you can see in the picture, it also encouraged us to engage in embodied experiment of floating in the water with diving gear and feeling like a seal. Tuuli reports that later seeing a full moon by the seashore has brought these dancing Selkies back as a reminder of the gathering and the really strong individual and collective experience. However, the most powerful transpersonal transformative insights to the gathering relate to the gathering itself. So what felt like random encounters with nature and other humans, the stories and different ways of making and being and knowing, really opened an unexpected space for emotional experiences and self-reflection. It also offered an opportunity to acknowledge uncertainty and instead of fearing, dive in, let go and make oneself both vulnerable and open the float in the stream of experiences and take action towards change. So to pass on the personal transformative experience, we have repeated the story of the Selkies over and over with friends and relatives, and also spiced the stories with learned facts about the Baltic Sea health. Second experiment, the open forest walks, comes from Markéta's reflections. So it's a case, open forest is a part of an ongoing series of experimental walks through various forest patches that are guided by diverse human and non-human navigators. In this case, we have walked through a protected forest area in central Bohemia, guided by Choi, here in the picture, a dog with rich sensorial knowledge of the local landscapes. So we followed Choi without a map on a regular basis. Let him decide where he wants to walk, which meant that we simply walk with and wait for what will come on our way. The point is to see what we can learn as humans if we give up on our control over our movements through time and space and try to attune the rhythms and interests of a non-human creature. We have indeed discovered new layers of the modern human forest life through our walks that were not known to us before, and we really invite you to read them in our paper. Both cases opened an unexpected space for self-reflection, looking at and into ourselves, our day-to-day life, the schedules, the values guiding our daily decisions from a somewhat distant perspective. For example, learning from the perspective of a dog to unlearn our usual ways of doing about the day and going about the day. Open forest case was much less structured, open to a wide range of human and other than human participants with an intention for experiential, multisensory learning enabled by shifting of power and moving together through multiple worlds of a forest. So in relevance to self-transformation in participatory design, the following three observations emerged from our reflections on these two cases. First, letting go to invite randomness. Also, trusting the emergence and shifting perspectives. For example, following and letting the more than human other, may it be real or imaginary, guide you and lead the way. In this context, we want to highlight the importance of noticing small events that might seem subtle and mundane at first, but upon reflection become critical in contributing to personal transformations. Small, incremental changes can be crucial to large-scale transformations. In systemic change, it cannot happen on its own, and so we argue that every mindful step counts. In this sense, self-reflective actions that feed the sense of meaningful inner change are important, like we shown every seal-inspired dive in the sea, every forest walk attuning us to local ecosystems. They really count. The two experiments also showed how inner personal transformation can occur in diverse situations and contexts, triggered and amplified by elements of spontaneity, open-endedness, emergence, and deliberate letting go of control in our various roles, for example, designers, researchers, and humans. These elements can help us to understand and raise further questions about how transformation from within may take place and how they can be better recognized and fostered and nurtured in participatory design. So the paper is of course limited by a small scope of examples, but we really hope that this contribution provides a small step towards hopeful change. So thank you very much, and we are very much looking forward to further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Very delightful and interesting paper. Today, Markéta is representing the authors and will take some questions. If you have any from the audience, you can post them in the chat. I can see some clapping and comments coming. If anybody will have any questions, please post them to the chat. So maybe I can start by having one question that I was thinking of, that it's very interesting to look the inner world and the inner transformative experiences. And you also mentioned in the paper that the participatory designers are very good at opening up and making these flexible spaces for these transformations. Could you elaborate how we could, as practitioners and design researchers, create these spaces that would take into account more of these transformations and looking to our inner worlds? What means there and tools there could be?
Yeah, so I think that in this specific case, we were really playing with, the methods that you can call something like on the ground, and we were really starting with something that we already have around us, something that is already embedded in our everyday lives. That's especially the case of the Bohemian walks with the dog. So trying to look at something that is already there rather than necessarily creating new infrastructures, new occasions, bringing together more materials to bring people together around some kind of prototyping and playing with material things, but rather do something as possibly simple as walking into a forest and following a dog's sense of direction, or sitting near the sea and really like deeply listening and thinking about the local legends around the more than human ecosystems there. So maybe I would say that the word here can be something like humbleness or taking things somehow, from the ground.
Thank you. Very inspiring. I think. Any questions so far? Also, you mentioned in the paper there's these three qualities or directions that you share: letting go to invite randomness, and trusting the emergence, and shifting perspectives. I was especially thinking about this invite randomness, and you were saying that in your experiment you were following the dog, and so how could we use this same method in other contexts? That could you give us an example how we could use this same frame of mind and attitude and a mindset?
So maybe one thing with the inviting randomness, we have been specifically playing with what we call feral creative approaches, which are inspired by the Feral Atlas by Anna Zink and colleagues, which kind of refer, to the idea of accepting that there are elements that emerge from within human infrastructures, but they unfold beyond our human control. So this is where the sort of point to the uncertainty in design comes from. But I have to say that also from the personal account of walking in a forest, the ability to do things like this and invite randomness requires certain privilege. So, walking with the dog and really forgetting about my own schedules and following the dog's sense of time, which requires long hours staring at the squirrels, or sitting near the water and just waiting when the dog will want to go, because I was really following him without pushing any direction or pointing anywhere. It really requires me to have the privilege to do this, to know that I can come home, I have a job, I have income. When we got soaked, for instance, because there was a heavy rain outside in the forest, and I was still following the dog, so we were still walking outside even in the forest when it was raining. I know that I can come home and there is a fireplace and there will be fire and I can get hot again. I can have a cup of tea, and all these things I think are quite important to acknowledge, that this process of inviting randomness and uncertainty in design as part of our methods is something that doesn't, come by default and doesn't need to be necessarily accessible for everyone. So in a way, it's also problematic in this sense.
Thank you. Now we have a few questions. I think Michael was first to ask how to motivate people to participate, and he continues, I'm asking from experiences of people being reluctant to invest in, for example, identifying, performing with other species. So do you have experience on how to motivate people?
I would say that it needs to come from like personal motivation. I think if you don't want to, perform and become a seal, if you don't want to become a seal, you can't become a seal. If you don't want to walk with a dog and be inspired, you can't walk with a dog and be inspired. So I think that there is some element of like willingness, wanting to do it, which is quite personal, and how to, of course, we are not, willing to push people to any kind of change, and really like throw them in nature and kind of like push some kind of reflection. So I think that the personal interest is quite important there. But of course, creating these like non-intimidating environments and easy access events, I think is also quite important. So from a different experience of, for instance, organizing workshops around food, like more than human food relations at conferences, that's problematic because not everybody has access. So it's a place where not everyone can actually come and get inspired. So that's for a different discussion, of course. But I think that this kind of making things accessible and speaking languages that people can understand, maybe rather than very complicated academic languages, might be something to look at.
Thank you so much. Now I can see there's other questions also, but we can return to them after all the presentations, or you can take the opportunity to write the answers in the chat. It's up to you, Markéta. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now it's time for the second presentation and the paper by Michael Haldrup and Kristine Samson and Thomas Laurien. And the title of the paper is Designing for Multispecies Commons, Ecologies and Collaborations in Participatory Design.
We are Cristina Samson and Michael Haldrup from Roskilde University, Denmark, and our paper is written with Thomas Laurien, University of Gothenburg, Sweden, and is entitled Designing for Multispecies Commons. Apart from the three of us, we also want to acknowledge the practical knowledge that comes from being entangled with artists, anglers, and activists in and around the urban landscapes of Borås and Copenhagen, collaborators who have significantly contributed to our understanding of what multispecies commons might be. In recent years, participatory designers drawing on environmental humanities and feminist theory have increasingly reflected on how to expand the notions of participation in participatory design, also to include the voices and interests of more than human actors and concerns in design processes. Work from, for example, Yoko Akama and others presented at the Participatory Design Conference 2020, but also other contributions from Lindström, Ståhl, Fjelland, and so on, response to more general calls for decentering anthropocentric notions of agency and ecologies, instead repositioning the role of design and the designer as planetary. However, we still struggle with issues of how to, in practice, integrate, represent, and acknowledge the interests and rights of non-human others in the design process. Our paper is an attempt of an opening up towards this, in particular by drawing on two sources of inspiration, the emergence of the planetary as concept and category, and multi-species studies. As Deepas Chakrabarty has observed, the emergent category of the planet in the humanities seem to indicate a shift in concern from the sustainability of human society to a non-anthropocentric concern for the habitability as such of our planet, arguing that the question is not how life is managed in the interest of power, but rather what makes a planet friendly to the continuous existence of complex life. Translated into a design context, this means that we are challenged with addressing not only the interests, preferences, and desires of human agents, but also of the multiple other species that we share and co-inhabit the planet with. Our second source of inspiration in pushing the limits for how to incorporate such a planetary framework is the still developing field of multispecies studies. In line with these, we acknowledge the need to facilitate ways of speaking of our own survival contingent on entanglements with multispecies assemblages, what Deborah Bird-Rose has called multispecies knots, and in doing this engage with the numerous representations, aesthetizations, and enactments in which everyday practices such as distribution on social media, activism, and artistic practice also play their part. In the paper, we draw on two ongoing case studies on urban design in relation to respectively River Viskan in Borås, Sweden, and Amagerfællet or Amager Commons in Copenhagen, Denmark. Both cases illustrate the potential tensions between human-centered urban design and development on one side, and the interests and claims of other species for livable environments on the other. To address this issue, we have engaged with knowledgeable practitioners in the case of Borås, where fieldwork was performed by Thomas Laurien, urban activists and anglers. In the case of Amagerfællet, where Cristina, Samson and I are doing fieldwork, environmental activists and artists. In the case of Viskan, the pressure for constructing housing and green park areas along its banks has also led to regulation of the water flow of the river, as seen in the picture. Although this wall doesn't look like a wall the way we humans may imagine it, and many humans would probably even experience it as beautiful, it still acts as a definite and brutal wall for individuals of the local fish community. In that sense, urban design acts as a very means by which the river, its water flows, ecologies, and primary inhabitants, such as the brown trout, is slowly being trapped and poisoned. In mapping this, the knowledge of local anglers are invaluable, as they provide tacit knowledge of this process. Paradoxically or not, the hook and the care come as a pair. Many anglers spend a huge amount of their time in proximity with water and fish and interact with both schools of fish and fish individuals, as well as the mood of the water. As a result, they often become very knowledgeable about the eases of different species, that is, their distinctive embodied ways of being in the world.
So next case is on Amager Commons, which is a thriving ecosystem less than 4 kilometers from the city center of Copenhagen. Formerly, it has been used as a commons for pasture, a garbage dump for the expanding city, a shooting ground for the military. The commons can be understood as a nature-culture entanglement over time in which humans, nature, and multiple species have joined forces so as to create a thriving ecosystem, which has become the habitat for multiple species such as the great newt, the skylark, deers, as well as humans. As such, it serves as a contemporary commons for the cohabitation and as a space for encounters and commoning between species. Due to its closeness to the city center, however, and an increasingly neoliberal and accelerated urban development in Copenhagen, the commons is also a construction site currently for the future urban development of Common City. On the commons, we have worked with Frej Smedes from the activist group Embassy of the Species. He explains where and how the newt lives, and how the development of Common City will cause severe damage not only on the habitats of the newt, but also interrupt and disturb the thriving ecosystem. It is important to protect sites where species can breed and expand their living conditions and not only survive. Amager Common is such a place, and that is what we are fighting for, that it will remain a thriving and expanding ecosystem. Here the great newt plays a key role as an ambassador species, Frey argues. Another way of pointing to the rights of other species is, according to Frey, to give them a face we as humans can recognize and mirror ourselves in. Aesthetics and sensory ways of encountering other species, he explains, is important to make humans understand the lives of others and how we are connected. So some conclusions. The two cases question the role of design and designers. Both engage with how designers can sustain existing ecologies and repair the damage done by current practices of urban design and planning. The cases point to the values that can be gained for designers from teaming up with knowledgeable and passionate people from non-designerly positions, environmental activists and anglers, for example, and how we as designers can use our platforms to amplify their experiences and voices. The cases also show how participatory design practices can work with an earthly commoning in between humans and other species. Here we see the role of the designer as a planetary thinker and a commoner. So both cases illustrate how designers can learn to listen differently by expanding perceptions and practices into multi-species worlds, hence working for reimagining and repositioning the various entanglements with lives and rights of other species into human consciousness and into the public debate. Participatory design may become a powerful tool for reclaiming control over our connected lives and over the conditions of our reproduction. Concluding, we see the role of the design as that of commoning, democratizing urban landscapes as multi-species commons through political and designerly acts insisting on planetary citizenship, multi-species rights, and claims descended from human exceptionism. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the presentation video. Such an exciting paper. And I mentioned in the beginning of the session that actually I'm very located next to Amager now and the Amager Common. So I'm very much near to one of the locations. Anyone having questions in the chat? No, not yet. So maybe I'll start then. And I've learned that Kristine will be mainly answering the questions. So I had a question about changing the role of the designer that you have in the last part of your presentation, talking about designer being a commoner and doing the work of commoning. Could you elaborate how this worked in the Amager case, for example? How did you do the work of the commoning? What does it entail?
Thank you for the question. I think that so this is only one aspect of our field studies. So working with Frey, which is very knowledgeable, because he's an ambassador for the great newt, he knows a lot about the specific species. But we have also done similar stuff to the other presentation we heard just before about attuning into other species. So I think there's both an discursive way of doing commoning is actually to get to know about other species, but it could also be a more embodied and sensory approach, reminding me of the attunement we heard about in the other presentation. And I also think I would like to comment, so when we propose the designer as a commoner, this is actually also to break with the whole development discourse we know from design, that the designer is one who develops things. Actually, to become a commoner would rather be to withdraw from developing or changing things, but actually learning to sense and experience differently. So this is also in the commoner thing, and I think it very much taps into the former presentation on attunement to multi-species others.
Thank you very much for the answer. And I think other scholars and they have also mentioned that you can only do the work of commoning if you are closely related and engaging with the commons in question or with the field side. You also mentioned a local knowledge, and I think it was also present in all of the papers in this session, like how do we bring up the local knowledge into the design or into different designs? Do you have any take on that? Like how do we enhance or mediate between different local knowledges in these sites?
Perhaps I can jump in here. I think that a great point in also in relation to the last paper is that a lot of knowledge is there already out there. We have in our paper, we have a group of environmental activists that we are ourselves kind of part of, which is also represent a certain kind of local knowledge. And in the other case we are discussing, where Thomas Laurien performed the field work, we have, and that's perhaps provocative given the theme of this session, we have anglers as kind of people representing local knowledge, but I think that I would formulate it in the same way as in the paper we just heard first in this session, that there is a lot of knowledge that is out there. We don't have to create the circumstances as an experiment or prototype or something like that. Knowledge about design solutions, the positive, the negative effects on the environment, on social relations is already there. So it's really a matter also of partnering up, participating, and perhaps most important, to listen to all those kind of local knowledges that are both human and non-human. We heard about the other species, and in our paper, it's kind of a discussion with Fry, the environmental activist, on how to listen to the great mute.
Thank you. Very good point. And I very much was thinking of the mention about this creating partnerships and thinking how this relationality between different entities, human and non-humans, and how do we maintain these relations and how to create new ones. Thank you so much. Any questions from the other participants in the chat? If not, then I will ask you to, I'm sure that you will have some questions at the end, so please post them in the chat room so we can address them at the end of the session. Thank you so much, Michael and Kristine. And now we are going to the third presentation of this session by Ned Cooper. And the title is Would the Trees Dim the Lights? Adopting the Intentional Stance for More Than Human Participatory Design.
Hi, my name's Ned Cooper. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose lands I'm recording this video, and pay respects to elders past and present. Today I'm presenting my exploratory paper entitled Would the Trees Dim the Lights? Adopting the Intentional Stance for More Than Human Participatory Design. As many attendees at this conference will know, design has been dominated by a human-centered paradigm for almost 4 decades now. Recently, however, scholars of more than human design have been experimenting with design processes to try and shift design mindsets. Several contributors to this conference, for example, have pushed the design community to try and transcend the limited focus of human-centered design on human entities and consider a broader set of relations. To date, there have been experiments situating designers in the environment in which a technological artifact will operate, and experiments encouraging designers to embody non-human entities in those environments, to kind of consider the experiences of other species or things. However, as Yoko Okama and others noted at the 2020 Participatory Design Conference, participation implies the equivalent of human voice, rights, representation, and structures of decision-making. So while situated or embodied experiences may enable designers to kind of see other worlds more clearly, there's a need to design processes that legitimate the perspectives of non-human entities through participatory design. My paper explores how adopting the intentional stance, which is a concept from philosophy, could enable the participation of entities from the biophysical and ecological worlds in addition to the human world. So a brief overview of the intentional stance. Daniel Dennett described the intentional stance in his book of the same name. In essence, Dennett argues that when we predict or explain the behavior of another entity, which could be a human, an animal, an artifact, really any object or system, we view that entity at varying levels of abstraction. In the first level, we predict the behavior of an object or system based on its physical structure. We may abstract from the physical stance to the design stance, predicting the behavior of a system based on our experience or knowledge of how the system is designed. And then finally, the most abstract of all the stances is the intentional stance, which requires no knowledge of either the physical structure or the design. We predict the behavior of another system from our own explanations or interpretations of the beliefs and desires of the other system. In the paper, I argue that adopting the intentional stance might be a useful way to predict the behavior of an entity if it were to participate in design activities by treating that entity as if it had mental states. We might use the intentional stance as a strategy to interpret the behavior of an entity as if it were a rational agent that govern its choice by considering its beliefs, desires, or intentions, which are its mental states. But there's a question as to the conditions under which an entity from either the biophysical or ecological world could be considered to have a mental state that's discernible to human designers. In 2020, I worked with a local council in Australia as part of a team of researchers from the ANU to review the plans and progress of a smart city project. Our report recommended the council adopt a more than human design framework, responding in part to the destruction caused by the 2019 and 2020 Black Summer bushfires here in Australia, which had affected Queanbeyan, which is the region in which the smart city was located. However, we were unable to provide clear processes for the council to enact that framework, that more than human design framework. This led me to search for theories or heuristics that might translate into design processes and eventually to the intentional stance. In the paper, I experiment with adopting the intentional stance in the context of smart lighting systems. Many smart cities include smart lighting systems, including in Queanbeyan, as shown on this slide. And those street lights shine brighter when pedestrians are in the vicinity of the lighting system. So human and non-human entities must coexist with artificial light at night in Queanbeyan in variable intensities. Please check out the paper for my attempts to discern what the mental states of trees and particles of air might be, drawing on secondary ecological research and how I sort of try to interpret the behavior of trees and particles of air based on those mental states. I won't go into detail about those experiments in this presentation, but ultimately, in the case of the trees, I argue that a designer adopting the intentional stance would predict that a tree ought to seek out light within a certain spectrum in natural cycles to optimize photosynthesis. And so, by extension, trees located within an area proposed for a smart lighting system, participating in the design of the smart city, would advocate for minimal disruption to lighting within those parameters. With this information, the council could then consider the perspective of trees alongside the perspectives of human stakeholders in the smart city. For example, residents of Queanbeyan may desire that the pavement in a certain area is illuminated alongside tree cover to improve accessibility and promote safety. But following the process enabled by adopting the intentional stance, designers may then consider tensions between the interests of human stakeholders and those of trees. In the paper, I also draw attention to 4 key limitations of adopting the intentional stance. Firstly, non-human entities may not act within the rational dynamic assumed by the intentional stance. Second, the intentional stance is focused on predicting the behaviour of an individual agent or aggregates of individual agents, but not collectives of agents. We might adopt the intentional stance to predict the behaviour of a tree, but what about a forest? And then third, adopting the intentional stance for more than human participatory design assumes that humans can and should speak for non-human entities. And then finally, the case study adopts the intentional stance to interpret the perspectives of entities within the immediate vicinity of a smart lighting system, but how might we expand the boundary of analysis to consider other entities, such as those affected by the supply chain for the lighting system? Alternatives to the intentional stance are also discussed further in the paper, including direct sensing from the environment and engaging more with indigenous epistemologies to inform design practice. I want to end by noting that the shift to more than human design is urgent. The biophysical and ecological worlds that sustain us both physically and spiritually are rapidly transforming due, at least in part, to our insensitivities to the interdependencies of life on Earth. To translate new design philosophies from the realms of academic research contexts into the everyday practice of design, we need to develop clear processes to enact more than human design. In the paper and in this presentation, I've tried to show how the intentional stance could become such a strategy, a kind of heuristic for designers to enable the participation of non-human entities in design. I encourage application and critique of the intentional stance, considering the limitations raised in the paper. Without developing such heuristics for everyday design, visions of more than human design for smart cities proffered by our research community risk being sidelined in the practice of technology design. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ned, for this fascinating paper and providing us or offering us ways how do we bring these perspectives into everyday designs. Any questions from the participants? A lot of clapping I can see. So maybe I'll start myself in case the other presenters have something urgent that they would like to ask first. Okay, I was thinking about these ways of bringing, you were explaining the difficulty of describing for the council how they could actually take into account for these non-human entities and their perspectives, and then you are suggesting this taking the intentional stance and how to do the translation work. Can you give an example of other setting that this intentional stance could work or you could see happening?
Good question. I think I've only really thought about it in the context of smart city design, because I was thinking responding specifically to this experience of this project. Other forms of design. I wonder if there's other forms of design that are in sort of landscape or environmental contexts. Certainly designing anything that operates in a sort of non-lab environment, I think is valid for this sort of approach. I guess the context for this project was, I was just surprised how many design decisions were being made by the council themselves, rather than sort of getting in sort of designers to build the smart city. And they had some frameworks, like they had the human-centered sort of design framework, and some processes that they sort of read about or learnt about, and they were employing that, and they were really motivated to do that. And they didn't have a way to sort of consider the environment that their town was situated in, but they were very concerned about the environment in which the smart city would sit because of the Black Summer bushfires. So I was sort of really interested in how we can help them do everyday design, like their everyday practice of design, using these new frameworks that we've all discussed. And I really enjoyed the last two papers because they talked about ways for designers to do this sort of practice. But I'm kind of interested in how that translates into frameworks for people outside of the design community. Yeah, so I'm going to have a think about where else it'll apply outside of smart cities. I think it's sort of anywhere outside of a lab, but I'll think about some more specific contexts, and I think I'll write back to you, Sana.
Thank you, Ned. We have questions in the chat. So Mela Peteka is writing, very cool presentation and perspective, Ned. Do you incorporate the vision of people with specific expertise in ecological domains? I wonder whether a regular human can imagine what a tree might think about lights. In my opinion, without specific expertise, we are at risk of misinterpretation. What do you think?
Yeah, so I would agree with that. Like, I think in the paper I tried to experiment with how I'd apply intentional stance, drawing on ecological research that I read. But one of the limitations of the paper is that it does rely on the designer making those interpretations. And so I think one way to extend this extend this sort of intentional stance, or this approach based on the intentional stance, is to sort of embed a process of reflexive practice that or documentation that provides some idea about where your sources are coming from, and reflecting on how those sources sort of impact your interpretations of a non-human, the mental states of a non-human entity. But I think that's totally valid. Like, it's really important to embed reflexive practice as part of this process.
Thank you. And then the next question comes from Michelle Westerlegen. Thank you, Ned. You mentioned that in the paper you also discuss other approaches, including designing with indigenous cosmologies. I'll certainly read up on this, but I was wondering if you could speak to that a little more. How does the intentional stance relate to these cosmologies?
In terms of how the intentional stance relates directly, I don't think it relates directly to the to indigenous epistemologies, but the kind of relational approach that it that informs it is very much informed by indigenous epistemology, at least as I've interpreted it for this paper. I think the intentional stance was conceptualized separately from indigenous epistemologies, but I do think certainly in Australia, and more so in relation to smart city design, that many councils are starting to engage indigenous consultants to work on how to develop their smart cities, and that's how some of their epistemologies are coming to the fore in terms of the design processes here. But I wouldn't say the intentional stance is like directly related to their epistemologies. It's kind of my attempt to incorporate it here is informed by that relational approach that many of those indigenous communities have. But yeah, I'm still learning how to incorporate many indigenous practices in the work that I do. So it's a good prompt. Thanks, Mela.
Thank you. And then Joyce is asking the same question I had in my mind when I was reading the paper, that how did the council respond to the initial idea of more than human?
So they were initially they were suspicious, I'd say. They weren't sure what it meant. And because we couldn't really give them a clear process that, like, the number of the earlier, I would have loved to see those two papers prior, because we might have been able to propose some measures that they could undertake to kind of do this work. But both those all require sort of like them going out and doing some practical work before they get to the process of design. So I'm not sure that we would have been able to incorporate them in the report itself. But yeah, I think they were puzzled and then motivated, because I think they recognized the sort of limitations of human-centered design, because the experience of the Black Summer bushfires were just so visceral here, and that they recognize much of our design approach around telegraph line, various things in Australia is informed by this either technology centered or human centered design. So they were interested, it sort of piqued their interest, but they didn't have a lot of sort of guidance on how to enact that. And I wrote to them and asked them if it was okay to refer to their project in this paper and share with them the intentional stance, but I haven't followed up whether they've actually implemented any of that.
Thank you, Ned, and thank you for the questions. And now we open up the questions for all panelists and all the paper presenters. And we already have one question from Simran Chopra. And Simran writes, I wanted to ask the panelists about the limitations of relationality and intentionality as researchers, designers towards understanding more than human cosmologies. And how do you think humans who are already part of these, like indigenous people or farmers or dog walkers, in these conversations? You can also revisit the question in the chat room. Any takers for this question? Kristine?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So first, I think there's a huge difference between relationality and intentionality. And actually relationality opens up for actually trying to think your intentions with designing differently and actually withdrawing from your intentions. So relationality, I see basically as trying to tap into the cosmologies, whether it's indigenous knowledge or attuning to other species and plants. And this, so this is also where I definitely like the notion of attunement, because attunement is not about your own intentions of doing things or how you want to relate to others. It's actually to try to get the other, whether it's a plant, an animal, another person, to establish a specific communication. And I also think it's interesting in terms of our own notion of commoning and commons, because a commoning does not mean that you have common ground or that you are equal, but you are actually trying to make. So it's a process of making something together. So I will definitely say, I think there's limits to intentionality as designers. I think we should withdraw from intentionality, but I think there's still huge potentiality in relationality, because it deals actually with trying to make more equal and try to make a dialogue beyond intentionality.
Thank you, Kristine. Markéta, do you have a?
Yeah, maybe I would just second what Kristine just mentioned, that especially within this modern human context, it's very tricky sometimes to try to sort of pretend or embody somebody else's perspectives, like perspective of a non-human creature. But there, the attunement, I think, is quite important, that we can try to attune by really following and listening and being maybe more silent rather than loud, and giving space for others to voice out their concerns, even if they speak or don't not speak languages, they enact their own languages. But there is this, I think, quite often within this modern human design area, this kind of maybe a bit fast notion of, oh, now we are speaking for all the more than human creatures around us, and we can include them, but actually, how do we know if they even feel included? If they even realize they are included? Like, for instance, working with the trees, what do the trees, how are they actually really involved in whatever we are trying to do around them? So this perspective of being with, walking with, sensing with, I think is quite important.
I think that if I can jump in here, I think that one important thing also in relation to what you're saying is that in lots of those perspectives, we cannot really empathize with the perspective or intentionality of a more than human entity in this. As you mentioned with the trees, they are probably quite indifferent to the walkers through the wood. I'm thinking about some of the interventions that our environmental activists have done around the Great Newt is actually a kind of a disturbance of their habitat because they are showing or photographing the Great Newt. And to take just also relating to another question in the chat, also when we have related to groups of anglers, they have a very clear, that's their perspective. They're of course interested in catching fish, but they're also interested in having a kind of ecological coexistence with an environment where there is fish. So there's a lot of different things that we cannot really go into. Relationality is in this context is not about that there are no conflicts, because there's a lot of conflicts of interests. There's a lot of frictions. There's a lot, as Cristina also said, a lot of power imbalances in this. But if we're going to work as designers in this context, we also have to listen. I think there was a great discussion yesterday on this I think in one of the first panels in the morning, about trying to move from thinking about a code of conduct or tick boxes to thinking about the designer as a listener and as someone who's assuring other participants in the design process that we are creating these things, that we're coming together, but that's not without conflicts.
Very good point, Michael. I think it's a very important to bring to discussion the struggle that is and the conflicts that they might be present in these entanglements, and when we are designing with non-human entities, and also with in the context of commons that Kristine, you were mentioning. And Ned, did you have any take on this question? Because I notice also that we're running soon out of time, so I just wanted to give you the last word if you like.
No, thank you. Thanks. I think the previous answers covered it well.
Thank you so much for all the panelists for this great session and the discussion, and thank you for the participants for thank you for participants for the questions and the dialogue. Also, I would like to thank for the Paulina, our student volunteer. And Paulina, could I ask you to show the last slides of the program and what is coming up next? So as you can see, the situated actions pass and the parcel is coming up next, and Ripple, and also PDC places showcase, and later the full paper track. Please, situated actions, in if I remember correctly, needs a sign up, but others you can just join. Thank you so much for joining, and looking forward to seeing you in other sessions coming up. Thank you all.